So before we move on and have a look at some of the proxies that are used in corals um, to tell us about past environmental conditions, I thought it'd be worth just to have a quick look about calcification mechanisms of corals. So how do they actually grow this hard skeleton? What's it made of? And this is important because this is the thing that's actually recording our proxies. So it's important for us to understand what it's made of and how it forms. So there we go. So yeah, so this is basically a slice through a coral. You can quite clearly see the annual banding that's forming in this fluorescent image. And actually, this fluorescence is not the I guess the inorganic coral calcium carbonate that's fluorescing. It's actually some of the organic material that's preserved in the coral. So I guess we'll come on in some of the future videos to look at some of the organic components in the skeleton. But we're just going to look now at the inorganic component, so that the calcium carbonate. How does the coral actually produce that calcium mineral? So here's I guess a cartoon diagram over on the right-hand side. This is a coral. The green thing is a kind of coral polyp, and that's sitting on top of this calcium carbonate skeleton. And as the coral kind of does its thing, it feeds and it photosynthesizes, and it basically grows upwards, and underneath that it basically secretes this kind of skeleton to support its body as it grows. And that's the thing that we're going to be looking at. So over on the left-hand side, there's kind of a zoomed in of this. We're basically this layer down over on I'm kind of colouring in red over on the right. That's this layer that we're looking at over here on the right-hand side. When I say right, I mean of course left. So we've got the inside of the I guess the coral is here, and then we'll have some kind of cells that form kind of like layers within the coral's body, and then the skeleton, the mineral skeleton, is this thing that looks a bit like a fence down the bottom. These are a representation of the crystals of calcium carbonate. Yeah, calcium carbonate skeleton. Yeah. Right. So what's happening at this? So to form the mineral calcium carbonate, this is our ultimate goal. We need to have some calcium, and we need to have some carbon kind of compound. So the calcium is abundant in seawater, and I guess the composition of the fluids inside the corals is very similar to seawater. But it's not just kind of like uniformly distributed throughout the cells of the coral. To get this mineral to precipitate out, we need to get the reactants, so ultimately calcium and the bicarbonate ion. We need to increase their concentrations to such a level that this mineral will precipitate out. So within the cells of the coral, there are basically pathways by which calcium can effectively be molecularly pumped from the seawater through to the site of calcification. And it's the same with the carbon-bearing species. So there's lots of CO2, dissolved in organic carbon, dissolved in seawater. So that's not just as the CO2 form, which you'll remember from the ocean acidification videos, but also as bicarbonate and carbonate ion. So bicarbonate ion is abundant in seawater. It's kind of there's plenty of it, but you might have noticed if you basically go to the ocean, although there's plenty of bicarbonate dissolved in the water at the beach, there's plenty of calcium dissolved as a salt. It's not spontaneously precipitating out calcium carbonate. To get it to precipitate out, we need to increase that concentration. So we can do that by adding more CO2, and that will increase the total amount of dissolved inorganic carbon. And in a coral, that can be achieved by the respiration of the coral cells. Although there's photosynthesis going on, there's also respiration inside a coral because it's an animal, and that will be producing CO2, which will raise the amount of dissolved inorganic carbon. But you'll remember from the ocean acidification kind of primers of the chemistry of that, if we just add CO2, then that will acidify the water locally, and it will actually lower the amount of bicarbonate that's available. So in corals and in, I guess, most organisms that calcify, there are mechanisms within the cells which can pre-concentrate the concentration of or the amount of bicarbonate ion, and it's a in the case of corals, there's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and that basically catalyzes the conversion of CO2 into the bicarbonate ion. So we have basically cellular processes which is going on, which are taking calcium and pumping it down to the site of calcification. And we're also taking dissolved inorganic carbon, either directly from seawater or the fluid within the coral, or we're concentrating, we're catalyzing some of that dissolved inorganic carbon from the CO2 form into the bicarbonate form, where it can then be pumped to the site of calcification. So we increase the concentrations of these reactants, and that ultimately leads via an intermediate unstable kind of calcium bicarbonate into calcium carbonate. Now, also, hopefully, you'll remember from the ocean acidification kind of primer that although we were producing this calcium carbonate via adding kind of calcium ions and bicarbonate ions that produce calcium carbonate, that will also end up producing an acid. So it will be acidifying this space here. And you recall that if you add acid to calcium carbonate, it will tend to dissolve. So there has to be another mechanism that the coral performs where it takes this acid, these excess, I guess this is expressed here as the carbonic acid, but other versions of this equation will show it as just H+. We need to take that acid and we need to get it out of this calcification space. So that also involves the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Which is great. So we can now be kind of, well, so the coral can be pumping the reactants in to the calcification site. The calcium is pumped in and the bicarbonate is pumped in, and the waste products, the waste acid, is kind of taken away, which is super cool. Now, actually, the details of how this calcification actually happens, because if you actually look at a coral, it doesn't look like kind of inorganic crystals that you might get if you were maybe crystallizing out salt crystals or whatnot in a beaker in the lab. It looks kind of, quite organic, although it's an inorganic mineral, although it's organically formed, which is kind of confusing terminology, but there we are. It's actually a little bit unsure. Scientists are unsure about the exact mechanisms by which corals perform this precipitation. I guess there's one school of thought which is that the corals actually secrete an organic template. So there's basically a little layer of organic goo, which is kind of represented in this diagram here by these kind of like little squiggles here. And it's that organic template that determines the shape of the crystals that form, and therefore the shape of the coral. I guess the other school of thought is that what the coral does is it forms a very small space, kind of a fluid kind of like bubble underneath its body, and basically it's controlling the shape of the skeleton by controlling the shape of that little bubble, as allowing the coral to grow into that. Ultimately, I think for the purposes of understanding the proxies, what's really important to understand is that actually the processes involved are not just taking kind of the building blocks out of the ocean and just allowing them to precipitate. So we're not just taking calcium ions and bicarbonate ions and seawater and then producing calcium carbonate. There are a variety of basically biochemical processes that are going on that can preferentially affect different aspects of different proxies. So when elements are pumped in, so the concentration of calcium out here, so the amount of calcium out here, concentration in square brackets, might not be the concentration of calcium down in this space down here. The isotopic composition of the carbon and the oxygen might be modified as the carbon moves through the skeleton, through the animal to the site of calcification. So there are a number of processes that are going on that kind of complicate the formation of these little dupes. Yeah, so this is, yeah, I guess I already kind of mentioned this thing, that there's these processes catalyzed largely by enzymes within the coral animal, and these basically can modify the chemical composition. So they can modify how much calcium goes into the calcium carbonate and how much other elements go into that calcium carbonate. They can modify the isotopic composition of the oxygen and the carbon isotopes, certainly the carbon isotopes, because the carbon that ends up in the skeleton, this carbon here, is a combination of maybe carbon from the water, but also carbon from metabolism, and that might be subtly different. So what is the skeleton actually made of? So here's I guess a photo micrograph of, this is a Orites skeleton. The field of view is a couple of millimeters on this one, and maybe half a millimeter or so, maybe a bit less on this one. So you can see on this there are kind of dark patches. It's a dark patch in the coral. There's these dark patches that seem to line up down the center of these parts of the skeleton. These are organic, rich parts of the coral, and from these you can see radiating kind of needles of, in this case, the mineral aragonite. Okay, and we'll have a little closer look. So this is the actual mineral structure of that aragonite, made up of, in its, I guess, its purest form, calcium, which is the Ca, carbon, and oxygen. And the proxies that we're largely going to look at for the rest of these lectures will be variations in the element calcium. So sometimes different elements can substitute in for this calcium here. Different isotopes of carbon and oxygen can substitute in for these guys here. So this is the mineral formula: calcium carbonate, CaCO3. And we might be looking at, and we'll certainly be looking at in the next video, how the different isotopes of oxygen get preserved in coral skeletons and what they tell us about the environment. There are different isotopes of carbon that can exchange and be preserved in the skeleton, and they tell us all things about, I guess, certainly when the coral formed, but also where it might have been getting some of its food from. And although the pure mineral calcium carbonate is just 100% calcium in the calcium site in the mineral, other elements can substitute in there. So we can get different impurities, and the relative concentrations of those impurities can tell us something about not only the abundance of those elements in the environment, but also the environmental conditions in which they were incorporated into the skeleton. And we'll be having a look at some of that in subsequent videos. So yeah, so that's the calcification. That's the producing this component. We'll also have a look at some of the organic components. So some of these organic compounds which end up trapped inside the inorganic skeleton as the corals grow, and what they can tell us about how that coral grew. And also the physical properties, so things like the density and of the coral, how that changes with different conditions. So that's to come. Yeah, there we go. Let's stop there, rewind, take notes, grab a screenshot. Yeah, fun times, that kind of thing.